So good afternoon, everyone. This is Stacey Barter from BC Healthy Communities, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is an introduction to collective impact. Before we get started with the webinar session, which is being hosted in partnership by BC Healthy Communities and Innoweave, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone's webinar technology is working. So hopefully you can hear me now. I know there were a few questions in the chat box about the audio. So just a few notes before we get started. The audio for today's session is through your computer speakers. So you'll want to have your computer speakers on unless you are a presenter. And if you are having any technical difficulties with the audio, there is a teleconference number that's provided in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So you can feel free to dial into the teleconference line if you have any audio issues. The other things I'll just point out are that today's session, we really invite your dialogue and your participation. I know many of you have joined together with your partners at host sites and have already taken the first half hour to have some discussion and dialogue. We hope to continue that virtually. So we have the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And we'll be using that today for you to input any questions or comments that you may have throughout the session. Don't feel that you need to wait until the end of presentation to use that. You can type in questions whenever you want, and our team will monitor that. So hopefully we can loop back to most of the themes that come through the chat box. So let's just test that out just to get started. I'll invite all of you to use the left-hand corner of your screen with the chat box. And you can just type in your name, where you're participating from, and if you're at a host site with multiple people, let us know how many people are there. Great, I can see the chat box seems to be working for everyone. Very nice. And it looks like we have people from all over the province. We'll get a chance in a minute to hear some of the communities that are participating today, but I see folks from Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Cranbrook, Abbotsford, Surrey, Vancouver, Creston. Fantastic. So the chat box is there, again, for you to input your questions throughout. And if you are having any technical issues with the webinar platform, you're welcome to follow along just listening into the teleconference. And the presentation for today's session is available for download on the BC Healthy Communities website. So you should have received a link to a PDF version of the slides, so you can always follow along manually if there are any issues there. And we are recording today's session, so we'll make the recording available afterwards. So hopefully everyone is good to go with technology, and we'll go ahead and start. So again, I just want to extend a really warm welcome. As I said, I know many of you have joined together for the first half hour to have some discussion and dialogue, so hopefully the conversation about collective impact has already begun for many of you. First of all, I just want to welcome my co-presenters today. We're going to be hearing from members of our BC Healthy Communities team as well as Innoweave's team that are involved in collective impact. So we'll be hearing from Michelle Calusi, who is a collective impact facilitator and coach that's worked extensively in British Columbia. Michelle brings years and years of community development experience with a really strong focus on multi-sector collaboration and a lot of expertise around the collective impact framework and approach. So she'll be sharing some of her experience. Also so pleased to welcome Jillian Rodak from Innoweave. Jillian is a program officer with Innoweave and has been doing a tremendous amount of work in the province of Ontario supporting various collective impact initiatives there. And we're really lucky to have Jillian to share some of their learnings from the rollout of some very intensive collective impact processes in Ontario. So welcome to Jillian. We at BC Healthy Communities have had the great honor and privilege of working in partnership with Innoweave for about the past year and a half to deliver collective impact training and coaching across the province of BC. So we're excited to continue that partnership and looking forward to working with many of you, hopefully beyond today as well. Last but not least, we have Maggie Bainham, who is a sustainability planner with the City of Surrey. And the City of Surrey is one of the communities that we, through BC Healthy Communities and Innoweave, have been supporting in some collective impact work. And Maggie is going to share some of her really on-the-ground experience with this approach. So again, I think that will be really useful learning, and really excited to have Maggie on the call today as well. So I thought I'd start just with a brief introduction for those of you who are not familiar with BC Healthy Communities, and then I'll invite Jillian to tell you a little bit about Inuit. So BC Healthy Communities is a not-for-profit organization. We've been around for about 10 years in the province of BC, and we work with communities all across the province. The focus of our work is really around supporting community and sector leaders who are trying to tackle some deeply rooted healthy community challenges that we see in our communities. And we do this in a number of ways. We offer a lot of different capacity building supports with a really strong focus on how we can work together across sectors to influence systems change and really collaborate more effectively so that we have more impact on issues that we're facing in our communities. Some of the ways that we support this are similar to our partners at Inuit. We offer a range of capacity building supports, including facilitation, workshops, and training. We have some granting programs and some coaching supports to support communities who are trying to tackle some of these challenges. Our approach, we use this model of seed, grow, and harvest, so seeding the field with new information, introductory sessions such as today. Growing the change makers is really about how can we work together in more intensive processes to deepen our impact. And then our harvest focus is really about sharing out our learnings and those of our partners as well. Our capacity building approach really focuses on 5 key capacity areas that are listed on this slide here. So first, a focus on building collectively our literacy around healthy communities, so understanding how the health and well-being of people is so influenced by the communities in which we live. The other areas that we work to strengthen are a focus on multi-sector collaboration. So when we're dealing with complex and deeply rooted healthy community challenges, we know that no one sector can really address this on their own. So it requires a whole new set of capacities to work more effectively across sectors and across partners. We also have a strong focus on developing leadership through a shared leadership model. So again, with that focus on collaboration, what skills and capacities do we need to work more effectively together? Adaptive learning in action is this focus on ongoing learning, knowing that traditional planning processes, when we're trying to affect very long-term change, don't always work for us in the traditional ways that we've approached planning. So we need to be prototyping, experimenting, and learning as we go and building that into our practice. And finally, the focus on systems thinking, understanding how different parts of the system are connected so we can have more effective change processes that identify key leverage points. So all of those make up very important components of the collective impact approach, which I think you'll see threaded throughout our discussion and exploration today. I'm going to turn it over to Jillian just to introduce a little bit about the work they do at Inuit. And Jillian, I'll just remind you that you'll need to press *6 to unmute.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you. Thanks.
Fabulous. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hosting me. I'm here in Ontario. I'm so excited to see how many communities from British Columbia are engaged in today's webinar. So I am a program officer with Inuit, which is an initiative of the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, which has turned is almost turning 80 years old, and really exists to create a more inclusive and sustainable society here in Canada. And with so much exposure after all these years to the nonprofit sector in Canada, there was some recognition around some newer, I guess, challenges or pressures over the past 5 or 10 years, including things like fewer donation dollars to go around or more stringent accountability requirements, reporting requirements, or even new problems that we were faced with that we're trying to solve. And so what was happening is that some organizations in the country were starting to find ways around these pressures in some really innovative ways. And so we think of those innovative ways as approaches to social innovation. And so looking at those approaches to social innovation, we thought, well, can we help apply these approaches to social innovation to the rest of the country? A lot of people are excited about social innovation. A lot of people are talking about it, but is there an opportunity to help bring those approaches to a much more tangible level? And so Interweave is really the Foundation's response to bringing tools for tangible social innovation approaches to the nonprofit sector. And so maybe some of you have heard about us before, maybe you visited our website. What you'll see is a whole range of supports that we can provide. I'll speak to that in a moment. And each of these modules that you're looking at is a different approach to social innovation, and within each one you can apply to receive coaching, workshop, support. We've done so much learning. Interweave has been around now for about 3 years, and in that short time we've learned so much about what works. You'll see the number 1 and the number 2 on this slide I have here. And what we've realized is that before diving in to these approaches to social innovation, the most important thing you can do is to get super clear on what the problem is that your organization or your group is trying to solve, and then from there get clear on that impact that you're trying to achieve. And from there, you can do things like grow your impact through, for example, our scaling impact or our social enterprise module, or you can integrate your efforts to generate transformative impact through something like collective impact, which we'll speak a lot about today. And then ultimately you can learn and adapt as you innovate through something like our developmental evaluation module. And what we've also learned is that groups and organizations are much more successful with a range of supports. And so really the Interweave process is pretty standard across all the modules, includes a range of supports, taking you from a place of knowledge through to action and then ultimately results. So we provide really a series of workshops and coaching, and in some cases some launch grant opportunities within each of those modules to help enhance your impact and really get that clarity and then help you go from there to take your impact where you want it to go. And we've done this with many organizations already, starting from that info session stage where we've engaged over 100,000 organizations to that workshop stage where it's really an intensive, often a full day, working day with a facilitator to work through some of these pieces of that whatever social innovation approach you wish to work through, and ultimately to results. And we've seen over 300 organizations go through to the end of that process. So I'll throw it back over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Jillian. So today's session is really an opportunity to learn more about the collective impact framework. What we've seen in our work in BC is that there really is such a growing interest in working across sectors to have more impact on complex community issues. And we know that the scale of the issues that are being tackled varies, and therefore the approaches also need to vary. So today is really an opportunity to learn about collective impact and its fit as a model to support some of the collaborative work that many of you are involved with. And really look at what is it all about and is it appropriate for your issue and your community. We will have some time at the end to explore some options for those of you who are interested in following up and learning more about collective impact and going deeper with that learning and that action process. And we also will offer up some options and opportunities for those of you who may decide that, in fact, this is not the best fit or the best approach for the issues that you are dealing with at this time. It's our hope that this session will, more than anything, help to clarify when collective impact is appropriate and when other approaches may be a better fit. So before we get into the content of the session, it would be great to get a sense of who is here with us today. So I'm going to start just by pulling up some questions onto the screen, and I'll invite you to respond to them by clicking the boxes to let us know who's here. If you're at a group site, I invite you maybe just to identify one person who can be a group scribe and input the information on behalf of your group. So the first question is just, are you participating as an individual or a group at a host site? And so we'll go ahead and let you fill that in. Give us a sense of how many of you are sitting in front of your computers on your own and how many of you are gathered together as groups. Fantastic. So votes still coming in, but it looks like at the moment we have about 45 people who are participating individually and at least 15 group host sites. Oh, numbers changing, as I said. That popped up to 47 and 16. Great. As I said, it's fantastic to see such representation from across BC. We had a call for one of our grant programs earlier in the spring, and what we really were struck with was how many groups that put in applications through that process were either already engaged in a collective impact process or really interested in learning more. So that was sort of the idea of hosting this session today, and providing the opportunity for more people to learn about collective impact was largely influenced by what we were seeing coming through from those applications. So I've just posted another poll on the screen, and this is just to get a sense of some of the geography of groups and individuals participating today. So what region of the province are you in? And I know a few of you are outside of BC, so you can let us know that as well. Okay. Again, votes still getting input, I believe, but it looks like we have really strong representation on the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, and coastal regions. We also have quite a few people in the Thompson, Okanagan, and Kootenay regions, and then a few people spread throughout the northern region on the north coast, Nechako, northeast, and a few others, it looks like. So we'll hear from our others who are typing into the chat box right now to let us know. Some of the others include all across BC, Columbia-Shuswap region, and some folks who are in different regions in the interior region. Great. I'm also interested to hear a little bit about which sectors are participating today. Again, just to get a sense of who's with us. So a third poll on the screen, which sectors are represented. If you are in a group host site where there's multiple sectors participating, you can feel free to check more than one box. Okay. Excellent. So again, quite diverse representation it's looking like. So we have very strong representation from NGOs, from the non-governmental organizations and not-for-profit organizations. Very strong representation from the health sector and local government as well. And then it looks like we have a handful of folks from Aboriginal organizations and other levels of government, and as well as some folks from school districts and private sector and educational institutions. Again, we've got a few others, and people are letting us know in the chat box if they don't quite fit into any of those boxes. We have some environmental NGOs and some folks who are working across disciplines, it looks like. That's fantastic as well. I think I have one final poll just to, again, to give us a read of who's here, and that is whether you are participating today as part of an existing collaborative that's considering a collective impact approach, or whether you're just exploring this and thinking about convening such a collaborative. Excellent. So pretty good split between the two, it looks like. So about roughly half, well, actually growing divide, but more or less half of us that are thinking about it, and half of us who are, a little bit more than half of us that are part of an existing collaborative that's considering this approach. And then some folks saying they're supporting existing initiatives. So, excellent. Pleased to see the diversity that's here today, and I hope that will make for some really rich discussion. Again, just a reminder that we really invite you to share any of your thoughts and comments and questions in the chat box at any point. Before we move on, my final question, again, just to get a read on who's here, is if there's a particular issue you're focused on in or considering for collective impact, I'll invite you just to type that into the chat box. So I can see that some folks are saying already, they're giving an indication of some of the areas that they're focused on. Age-friendly communities, for example, is one that I've noted already. Be curious to hear from others if there are particular issues that you're focused on. So poverty reduction, HIV, again, poverty reduction, issues around healthy lifestyle, obesity prevention, housing. Again, poverty reduction seems to be a very strong theme. Some folks who are focused on food and agriculture, again, housing, and mental health and wellness. So great. We can see some strong themes that cut across groups, and I'll invite people to continue to add to that, and you can feel free to have a look at what some of your colleagues today are focused on. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our exploration of collective impact. And to start, I'm going to invite my colleague, Michelle Calusi, just to give us a little bit of context setting to understand a little bit more about why collective impact has emerged as such a strong focus for people who are looking at wanting to really have impact at a population level. So Michelle, I'll turn it over to you. I have just lost my webinar screen, so I just want to check in with you to see if that is just me or if that's you as well. Michelle, you'll want to...
I've got mine, Stacy.
Okay, great. So I'll just log back in and you can carry on.
Okay, thanks so much, Stacy. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today, and it's always such a pleasure to talk about collective impact and the kinds of issues we're trying to address with this particular tool. We do want to take just a couple of minutes at the beginning, as Stacy said, to frame the context for collective impact and be really clear that it is one model and set of tools for very particular types of challenges in our community. In response to, I think, what we're all seeing, that we're not, in fact, managing to move the needle on some of the most significant issues like poverty and environment and economic inequities and health issues. And so we do need to think about what we're doing isn't working. What can we do that will be different, that will work? So we start by positioning this particular model within an understanding of complexity and how the world is becoming more and more complex, in part due to technology and communication. We're more aware of things going on in the world, and we see more complexity, and there is more and more complexity. It feels like things are going faster all the time, very much like the knot on your screen. Things are interrelated, and it's almost impossible with these kinds of issues to figure out where to start. Where's the end? Where do you pull or push to start to unravel and even understand the complexity in order to be able to intervene and address it? Oops. Sorry. So we see this in global patterns, of course, in terms of climate change, economic inequity, and health issues. And we also see how these global patterns are manifested at the community level. Things like food security, early childhood development, air quality, transportation and infrastructure challenges that many, many of our communities are facing. So we know that not all problems are created equal. So we have some simple problems in our communities that we manage to address very well, like making a cake. There are things where cause and effect is very clear and straightforward, and we can create a recipe or a formula to respond. And if we go to 10 different communities, that formula is pretty much going to play out in a similar fashion. We also have complicated challenges, like the rocket ship, where cause and effect is not as clear. There may be multiple effects that we see depending on the environment, external influences, various factors that play out and conditions related to where we are or our environment. And so those are a bit more complicated, and sometimes we can figure out a bit of a formula, but we also need to stay open to learning and adapting as we go with complicated issues. So we move to complex issues, and really collective impact is a model designed very specifically for these complex issues where cause and effect is not at all clear, where there's very high levels of uncertainty, and in no two circumstances would the same actions necessarily yield the same results. So we think of complex issues, I think of it sometimes as, it depends, everything depends. So in these complex environments, we absolutely need to figure out new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and new ways of acting, both individually at the organizational level and certainly collectively across multiple organizations and sectors in our communities. So the collective impact framework and model has emerged in response to this complexity that we see. And I'm going to invite Jillian to tell you a little bit more about the framework in keeping with, understanding of complexity and how things change. Innoweave has taken a adaptive learning approach to their own work with the social innovation tools and collective impact. So Jillian is going to share not only what the model looks like today, but also some of the lessons and insights that they've discovered over the last 3 years of working with it. Over to you, Jillian.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, I think adaptive learning is a really great way to frame our approach to collective impact. And Stacey alluded to this earlier in the session to say that we've been fortunate enough to support a large number of groups. We're supporting over 25 groups right now in Ontario, specifically, and more groups across the country. We've done this in a pretty short amount of time, gotten groups sort of on the ground, working through the tough aspects of collective impact, and we've just learned so much, and I'm going to speak to that as I take you through this overview of collective impact. To start out is our way of defining collective impact. Now, some of you might have different approaches and ways of thinking about what it means. I think, though, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a group of organizations that are working together to address a major challenge by developing an integrated approach that fundamentally improves population-level outcomes in a community. And what we really focus on in our approach are those two pieces you're seeing in orange: the integrated approach, integrated being the operative word, and population-level outcomes. So what do we mean by population level? Collective impact initiatives define the people or the population that's being targeted. So who is really expected to benefit from the work that we're doing? And what we do is we define it as specifically as possible. So for example, children 0 to 6 years old in a particular neighborhood, a city or school district, or people living within a 50-kilometer radius of a particular nuclear plant. And we could go even more specific than that. And so what are population level outcomes? Well, population level outcomes reflect an improved well-being for children, adults, families, or communities. So for example, the community is safe, the environment is clean. Now, collective impact initiatives get to an even deeper level there, and they define the benefit that the population is expected to receive as a result of our work. So how is this population better off? And they set a very clear and specific target to quantify that needle movement, that improvement. So for example, increasing the number of children aged 0 to 6 meeting school readiness criteria at ABC school by 10%. And we would know very clearly what we mean by school readiness criteria. Or 98% of residents within a 50-kilometer radius know what to do in the event of a nuclear emergency. So again, we're looking at the outcome. So as a result of changing a system, or as a result of changing a policy, or maybe many of those strategies combined, what are we seeing in terms of a benefit to that very specific population? And so those of you who have entered that poll to say, yeah, we're currently working on collective impact, or some of you are exploring it, some of you have maybe heard a little bit about or read a little bit about collective impact. You've probably read or heard about the traditional 5 conditions of collective impact. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, an article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review written by Kanya and Kramer to say, here are some really exciting, successful examples of large collaboratives out of some communities in the States that have worked collaboratively and have seen real needle movement on some real indicators that the one that they speak about particularly is around school readiness. And so what they did was they looked at these few examples and they drew parallels between them to say, what are the underlying conditions here that are parallel amongst all of them? And can we take those 5 conditions, define them, and then help other communities across the world apply these conditions? And so this was a very foundational article for the movement, and since then we have communities across North America working to implement new collective impact initiatives. And as I've said before, Innoweave has been very fortunate to put these conditions to practice and see how they work, and in doing so have learned so much about what's working. And one of the things that we've learned is that actually some of these conditions are actually, while they're all important, there's a bit of a prioritization that is required, that not all of these conditions are actually created equal. So what you're seeing now is our reprioritization of those conditions. If you could call it a revised collective impact model. Really the idea here is the focus on the outcome and the integration piece, those 2 pieces that I highlighted earlier on in our definition of collective impact. So what you see is that our first priority is to help groups of organizations, or what we call collaboratives, get super clear on what their population level outcome goals are. And even before that, we work with groups to help them get clear on what the problem is. We've actually had examples in workshops where groups are working to define their problem, and where they thought they were totally aligned on what they were going to be working on, they couldn't even agree on what the problem is that they were trying to solve. And as a result, a few of the members of that group actually left, which is a good thing, and that's why we prioritize it, so that you can figure that stuff out and get clear on that stuff first before going into the rest of the pieces. And as many of you probably know, collective impact is an approach that requires a tremendous amount of time and resources. So you want to make sure you're on the same page around the problem and, of course, the outcome, where you want to get to as a community before you get into the other pieces. And so the next priority, once you've got that clear population level outcome objective, is a clear model of the integrated efforts required to achieve those goals, that population level goal. And so we look back at the 5 conditions here, and what you'd see is a mutually reinforcing activity. So we've done a bit of rewording to clarify what we mean by that. And what we mean is integrated efforts and thinking about what are those very clear activities or strategies that are necessary to achieve that population level outcome goal, and that they would happen at an integrated level, so that you're not sort of working in silos, but these activities and strategies are integrated in order to align to that population level outcome. And so those are our first 2 priorities. Now, those 3 underlying pieces there are very important. In fact, they're pretty critical to ensuring that your collective impact initiative will succeed. We call these supporting elements. So shared outcome measurement and leading indicators, backbone coordination, we call this the backbone function. So what are those important roles or functions that are necessary to make sure that this collaborative continues or develops momentum and continues to have momentum? How can we ensure that we're accountable to ourselves and make sure that we're convening, and on all those little pieces that help keep us alive? And of course, continuous improvement in communication is so crucial to supporting a collective impact initiative, not just internally, and of course that's absolutely critical, but also externally. So engaging your stakeholders, people with lived experience, and developing your initiative and getting clear on the real problem and the outcome you wish to see as a community. So that's really our sort of revised model from those 5 conditions, taking them and reprioritizing them to really get clear on that population level outcome goal and moving from there forward. And we've seen groups really move quickly as a result of this process. And now we love talking about our example here in the Kingston region in Ontario. They're focused on youth homelessness. So what we'll do is we'll take that model and what we've done is we've taken the example from ending youth homelessness in KFL&A and applied it to our model to show you how this actually works. This group started working with us in about December of 2014. And through a lot of refining and work with the support of their coach, came to a population level objective to say that by 2020, 80% of youth who enter the homelessness system in KFL&A, that they maintain their housing or are housed within 30 days. You can see the specificity that they've gotten to here, and I will share a story later on about how they actually got to here to say that they came from a place where they came to us with an outcome that was really their strategies of how to get to that outcome, not necessarily their outcome. And so we worked with them to say, no, well, what is actually the ultimate result of these strategies? And so they came to a bit of a statement there, and then they worked with us, and we worked together to refine that statement to get to this very specific one. And they have clear data to show evidence as to that this will work. This will lead to that end of youth homelessness in the region. They have 4 key strategies around homelessness prevention, an integrated system of care, increasing the range of housing options, and ensuring regional engagement and coordination. And underneath those, and I'll speak to that a little bit later as well, they have very clear and multiple activities that align well to each of those 4 strategies, and then ultimately to the outcome. They know exactly which key indicators that they can measure on year to ensure that they're on track, and if they're not on track, what can they adapt to make sure they are. They have United Way of the region, serving one person there. Part of her full-time work is to actually focus on ensuring those backbone functions are filled. And there's continuous improvement as well, both externally and internally, as I had mentioned earlier. So we talk about determining whether collective impact is right for the impact you want to have. So we've learned all about our approach to collective impact. Now, how do we know if it's right? We love asking ourselves these questions, and we encourage groups to ask themselves these questions to help them do a bit of a self-test. Are you, as a group, aiming to affect needle-moving change? We can say 10% or more as a bit of a benchmark on the type of change we're talking about, but really it's a community-wide metric, and it's a transformative level of change that collective impact is useful to help. Do you believe that a medium to long-term investment is really necessary by all the stakeholders involved to make that change? Or could it be just something that could be changed by your organization alone, and maybe it's not necessarily needle-moving? Perhaps it can be changed by one of your programs. Do you believe that cross-sector engagement is essential for community-wide change? We've learned a lot about this one in particular to say that it may not necessarily be cross-sector engagement. It might just be different nonprofit organizations focusing on different areas of the issue to come together. Are you committed to using measurable data and sharing that data across the group? And are you really committed to working with other community partners and really integrating your work with them? And then we also like talking about this idea of the collaboration continuum, because we've learned that some problems can be solved individually, while others require organizations to really align their activities. So on that left of the spectrum, you might have organizations sort of dabbling and working around the same issue area, but they may not even know what each other is really doing. And as you move along that spectrum, you might see organizations starting to perhaps cooperate and coordinate programs, events, other initiatives. And the further that you get to that integration piece, what you'll see is much further level of trust is required. A huge amount of effort is required as well as accountability, but ultimately that impact can be transformative. And it's that integration piece where you really find collective impact. And so I'll end off this section by talking about what isn't necessarily collective impact. Again, we know how much of an investment this is in our time and resources, so we want to make sure when we get deep into it that this is the right approach for the kind of impact that we want to make. And there are lots of different types of impact that organizations and groups are making, and so collective impact is just one approach to get there. For example, if you're trying to scale a program, for example, if you're trying to grow that program, to grow the participation rate, that is a great impact objective to have, but it may not necessarily mean that you're changing population level outcomes, and so it may not require the collective impact approach. Setting broad and inclusive goals that are hard to achieve with the available partners and resources it might create some challenges that may not require or may not benefit from the collective impact approach either. There might be another approach that would be better. And so when I speak about those Interweave modules, when I spoke about them earlier in the session, for example, scaling impact, that might be a great module, provide some great resources and really support an organization that is looking to scale a program rather than move the needle significantly on a community-wide indicator. And lastly, collaborating and communicating and supporting one another, again, can be very, very beneficial. And I've seen many communities who've been working together at tables for years, and they're at that level where they're supporting one another and collaborating, but integrating their efforts isn't necessary for the kind of impact that they want to make. So with that, I will hand it back over to you. I believe it's Stacy.
Thanks, Jillian. Yeah, I'm actually going to pass it right over to Michelle, but as I do, I'll just draw your attention to some questions in the chat box about the example that you shared in the Kingston area. I know you're going to be speaking to that in more detail, but if you want to offer some answers in the chat box while Michelle is carrying on. Michelle's going to talk a little bit more about what the process might be if you wanted to dig deeper into exploring collective impact and working with this model with BC Healthy Communities and Interweave. So over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Stacy. So yeah, just again a quick piece on essentially talking about the tool that we use, both Interweave and BC Healthy Communities. Currently use a theory of change tool, which is a design tool that, again, is one tool. It's one way of tackling and understanding complex issues. We use this tool in particular because it's a hypothesis tool. So it is a theory. So people come together and, as Jillian alluded to very briefly, start to dig down and understand the nature of their problem. They gather data. They maybe consult with those who are affected or other folks in the community, and they try and figure out all the aspects of this problem. And as a result of that conversation, they get to this point where they have a greater clarity about what it is they want to change, for whom, and by when. And that's really the heart of that first step that Jillian identified on her slide. So because theory of change is a hypothesis tool, we do all this, but we hold it lightly. And we say, okay, here's what we think. We think that if we target these people in this way, through the how, the activities that Jillian talked about, then we're going to have X, Y, and Z outcomes that we hope for. And then we start to act. So we learn by doing. So we really, the theory of change is a fabulous tool for adaptive learning and action, which is one of the key practices that we use in complex adaptive systems. So it's a really important tool, but again, it is just one way of tackling, analyzing the problem, and defining more clearly the impact you want to have, and therefore, what are the strategies or interventions that we think will achieve that impact. So this is the tool that both of us are currently using, and Jillian is now going to tell you a little bit more about the Kingston Youth Homelessness Initiative and how they use theory of change.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. So some of you may have, again, heard of this idea of a theory of change. Often when we work with groups, when we work with them through their theory of change, we like to encourage a bit of a visual representation of your how. What are those key activities that are necessary to get to that population level outcome? And so I love showing this example because it shows how the current state of Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington counties is in terms of their youth homelessness system and where they want to get to in order to end youth homelessness in the region. At the beginning, so if you see on the left, what you'll see is that inner circle of the integrated system of care is quite large. And so originally when we began working with them, we got to a place where their population level outcome was to reduce the rate of youth homelessness in Kingston by X%. We thought this was a good way to start, and as Michelle mentioned, this idea of a hypothesis, we think this is the right approach. What we worked with them to do is we helped them pressure test that hypothesis. So gathering more data, and engaging the youth with lived experience, engaging the community to say, is this really the right approach? Is this really the right population level outcome based on the data that we're going to gather here? And what they learned was that when they looked at the homelessness system in the region, they realized that there were many youth that were actually homeless, but that they weren't even aware of them in the system. The youth were often, couch surfing or just not even accessing any of the services, perhaps because of the stigma around homelessness. And so from there, the collaborative said, okay, so if we know that there's a lot of youth that are homeless that we don't even know about, one of our goals, one of our things that we should be doing is to actually make them aware that these services exist. We should create awareness around the stigma of youth homelessness, create that comfort level so that they will come and access our services. So they started adapting their how. But when they started adapting their how, they realized that, okay, if we start raising more awareness and we have more youth entering our system, our intended impact that we originally had set out for ourselves around reducing the rate of youth homelessness will actually go up. So what they had to do is, based on all this data, they had to not only adapt their how, but adapt their population level impact statement, which, if you recall, was around not reducing the rate, but actually reducing the number of days that youth are actually housed and receiving permanent housing. And so what you'll see on the right side is that integrated system of care becomes much more integrated but smaller, because the hope is that through a tighter level of awareness, much deeper level of awareness amongst the community and amongst homeless youth themselves, and then a much deeper level of prevention services, which they learned through pressure testing was a very important piece of the system. Hopefully fewer youth will actually need to access that integrated system of care. And so you see that shift of thinking because of that pressure testing piece around, we had a population level impact goal. Let's get even clearer on our data and then adapting it based on that data. And what we like to do is here, I'm showing you just a snapshot of the group's theory of change. I mentioned before that they have 4 key strategies on how they're going to end homelessness, youth homelessness These sample activities in that middle column are just that, they're samples. There's many activities that they're doing within each of those strategies to achieve that goal. But as you can see, there's a complete level of alignment between the strategy, so for example, homelessness prevention, the sample activities, for example, an awareness campaign, to sample outcomes. For example, youth now know ways to avoid homelessness and that youth stay connected with families. And so you can see how we build a complete alignment through these theories of change to ensure that we are setting ourselves up for the best chance possible to achieve that outcome. And so one of the things we like to say is we can build these theories of change and we create these beautiful images, but it's really about the execution piece that matters. And that's why I like to show this slide, is to say that their awareness campaign is alive and thriving. They had youth actually develop it. These are real stories. These are real youth that their stories are actually put up around places where they learned from that youth actually go and hang out. So bus shelters, malls, other places, so that people are starting to actually see and recognize that this is real and it's okay. And hopefully the idea here, and we'll hopefully be able to get some results on that soon, is that youth are accessing those services and accessing the prevention services, and that this theory of change is really being put to life. And that's the idea here. And so, Michelle, I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks, Jillian. So just another example to kind of drive home some of the points that we're talking about here. And I think for me there's a couple of things that this illustrates, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what's on the slide in a minute. But this idea of huge, complex, messy systems and issues, and the first thing we do is make it even messier by trying to get even more information and more perspectives and understand more about the system or the issue that we're trying to tackle. And eventually, we do have to figure out a way to zero in. So where do we zero in? Where do we intervene to get the biggest impact for our existing resources and given our current community context? So again, it wouldn't be the same in any two communities. There's so many factors that are being considered here. And these diagrams, as Jillian said, are lovely, but they're quite simplistic. So again, in this complex sort of strategy of building a theory of change, we do need to find ways to simplify it and kind of communicate the essence of it. So I pulled a variety of information from the Seattle Roadmap website. This is an initiative closer to home for those of us in BC, in Seattle, and they've targeted the lowest income neighborhoods in all of Washington, South King County and South Seattle in particular, as a region where they want to try and increase the number of students who are on track to graduate from college or earn some kind of career credential by 2020. So this outcome was really driven by their identification of what they call the leaky pipeline. They had huge numbers of students that were dropping out, and for example, I think in 1 year they identified that they had, I don't know, X number of kids in 9th grade, and 5 years later, only about 30% of those kids were actually going on to anything after high school. So a huge kind of what they call leaky pipeline is what they're trying to address here in these particular neighborhoods where this situation manifested itself far worse than in other neighborhoods in Seattle. If you look at the bottom of the slide, that's really their theory of change. They know that they need to align the system. So Jillian talked about that, the aligning of multiple organizations, agencies, initiatives, programs, and services so they're rowing in the same direction and coordinating themselves. They know that parent and community engagement is another lever that if they can increase that, they think that will have some impacts. They want to bring the power of data to bear on their work, so they want to have and do have a very sophisticated tracking system And they're tracking that data, but they're also weaving it into their re-strategizing and adaptive actions on an annual basis, so continual learning. And all of this creates stronger systems, which will help them accomplish their goal. So that's really their theory of change. Those are the levers that they've identified. If you look at the red column on the left, right of the table, those are the 4 outcome areas. And you can see that they represent really the population demographics from essentially from birth through to post-secondary credentialing. And they've chunked up those population groups and then formed working groups, if you look at the green on the left, around each of those outcome areas. So agencies, organizations, governments, school districts, teachers, a whole range of folks, health workers who are connected with birth to 3rd grade are engaged in that working group. You can see that they're supported and successful in school, essentially the school-age folks. They didn't tackle all students in these neighborhoods. They tackled only English language learners, and they did that because among all English as a second language learners, they identified that they had the highest dropout rates of all learners in their system. So they chose to zero in yet again, not on all students, but on that one population of students. Similarly with youth graduating from school and moving on after high school, they're not targeting all high school students. They're targeting only those who drop out. So they have this focus on disconnected youth to reconnect them to the system in that particular area. So from this huge complex system, a continual process of refinement and zeroing in, and then tracking the data. So they have a very sophisticated system with a large number of indicators that they track in a variety of different ways across all 4 of their outcome areas. This is one example linked to the school-age children outcome area, where they're tracking what they call an early warning indicator for 9th graders. So, one of their theories was if they could flag students who were going to be in trouble early on, they could intervene and prevent those students from dropping out of school. So they track suspension or expulsion activities of students and then intervene in the hopes of being able to reduce that. And you can see very clearly since 2010, between then and 2014, this is in their 2015 data report, they've reduced it from 15 to 8%. So you can imagine the leap there early on from 15 to 17%, how valuable that would have been to them as a way of saying, oh, wait a minute, okay, what we're doing isn't working, so what do we do different? So the tracking is really integrated in their overall theory of change and all the work that they're doing there. So we talked a little bit about, Jillian talked a little bit about what it takes. Is collective impact right for you? These are 4 additional what we call preconditions for collective impact that we just want to touch on briefly. And we think of these not as black and white sort of go, no-go factors, but we do think they're important for all groups to be thinking about and to have assessed. And if you are weak in one of these areas, then that's a place where you need to give some attention and be thoughtful about how you're going to address that gap. So successful initiatives all have champions. Sometimes those are organizations who say, hey, we'll play the convener role, or we'll provide secretariat services for the first year of planning, or maybe 2 or 3 organizations working together who really are kind of the founders and conveners and facilitators of the process. Sometimes it's individuals within those organizations who have a charismatic kind of leadership that manages to bring people to the table and facilitate shared understanding around real diverse, different perspectives on issues. So think about the kinds of folks you have giving leadership. And that's really linked to this question of resources. So your human resources to give leadership are really important, but you also need those practical things like space and access to photocopier and money to support convening, perhaps, conversations in your community, or interviewing or surveying people, or accessing data and making meaning of the data. A lot of the groups that we work with have found it very useful to have external facilitation support them, for example, and that usually costs money. The urgency of the issue, this is a shift in how groups work, and it takes time. So if we think about a year of effort to get your theory of change organized, is the issue compelling enough to keep people at the table and to keep them working through the differences in order to arrive at that shared agenda around their theory of change? And all of this is easier if in your sector or in your community there is some history of collaboration that you can point to that's been successful as a bit of a foundation to kind of lead the way and say, you know what, we can do this. So just to be thoughtful about those preconditions for collective impact. Back to Stacey.
Thanks, Michelle and Jillian. Those are both just such great examples of some of the work that's been underway. I'm just pulling up a poll again, just a moment for those of you participating to take a second to reflect on this. Just sort of your gut reaction considering some of these preconditions that Michelle's just introduced. Which of these do you think you would have in place if you were considering embarking on a collective impact initiative or using this approach? And while you're filling that in, I'll just flag for both Michelle and Jillian that there's a couple questions related to the examples that you shared. And I know we're going to open up the session for some dialogue a little bit later, but maybe in the meantime, if you have time to type some reflections, each of you, into the chat box. There's a question about the geography for the Kingston example and a question about the backbone and the engagement process for the Seattle roadmap. So if you can take a minute just to type some thoughts there, people can pay attention in the chat box. So great. With the poll here, again, this is just a moment for you to have a chance to think about this. Obviously, you can go away and think about it more. But we see a pretty even split for people who are answering the questions about which of these pieces you have in place. And again, I think the key point that Michelle was making is just to be mindful of these and identify if there are gaps, how you might work to fill some of those. So we've heard a couple of examples from different areas, one from Ontario and one from Seattle. And now I'm so excited to invite Maggie Bainham, who we've been working with in the city of Surrey, to share a little bit about the process that they've been undertaking using a collective impact approach around the issue of food security in Surrey. BCHC Communities and Inuit has been supporting over the last year and a half about 10 different collective impact initiatives around the province of BC, and the city of Surrey is one area where we've focused our facilitation and coaching support quite extensively. So Maggie, I know you're in early stages of your development work in Surrey still, and so I think this will be really helpful just to hear about what that early process looks like and any insights you have for people that you might want to share. And
sure.
Just remind you, oh, you're good. You've already unmuted. I was going to.
I did, yeah.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks. Yeah, pleasure to be here and sharing some of our experiences working with BC Healthy Communities and Inuit for about a year on through a collective impact process, and actually really inspiring to see some examples that have been presented over the course of this webinar, just to remind us of all of those principles and kind of what we're moving towards. So yeah, we have a multi-sectoral team looking to address food insecurity in Surrey. We generally use the nuanced version, the nuanced definition of food security from the Plan H action guide for food security, but essentially it comes down to good, healthy food for everyone. And when the group first gathered a year ago, we hadn't actually identified food insecurity as the specific issue to address. We knew that we wanted to create a more sustainable food system, but began by exploring different issues within the food system more broadly, and looking at which were the most critical, as well as how the various team members' mandate and interests aligned in working towards those different aspects. So in the end, we actually mapped out the components of a sustainable food system and then chose food insecurity as the place to begin, given its complexity, its urgency, and the ability of our partners to lend time and support to addressing it. So we know, and we know even better now, that food insecurity has a tremendous negative impact on mental and physical health, healthcare costs, learning outcomes for kids in school, and job performance. And we also know that it's highly prevalent in some of our communities, and that it has a disproportionate impact on our already marginalized populations, which contributes to this cycle of poverty. Given the current rates of food insecurity, the strain on our existing support systems, and the added pressure from a rapidly growing population, we have about 1,000 new people moving to Surrey every month. We felt this was an issue that really urgently needed to be addressed and also needs a very upstream kind of proactive approach. So this is just, the slide here is one of the slides we've developed to kind of more clearly illustrate within one of our focus neighborhoods who's being impacted by food insecurity. So our group is comprised of a variety of key stakeholders within the community, which includes Fraser Health, the city, obviously. I'm within the sustainability office, but we also have representation from healthy communities within the city, which is in Parks, Rec, and Culture, as well as another couple staff members from Parks, Rec, and Culture that are based within the within our rec centers and community centers, so have more of that kind of frontline experience. We've got Sources Resources Center, which has a food bank as well as other supports such as employment services, the school district, the Surrey Food Bank, and a number of citizens who are passionate about this issue. So this group here defines what's our leadership team. And as we've, especially recently, as we've begun to really articulate and begin presenting our theory of change, we're seeing other partnerships emerging. So those include with post-secondary institutions, you know, a local settlement agency that works with new immigrants and refugees, the Rotary Club, et cetera. And all of this work emerged from an existing network of organizations that were already, you know, working towards and concerned about food issues in the community, called the Surrey White Rock Food Action Coalition. So we opted to embed this project within that coalition as it's already a well-known, connected, and collaborative group of stakeholders. So just going over sort of our timeline to get where we're at. We first met about a year ago, June 2015, at a BC Healthy Communities and in a Weave workshop to spark interest and commitment to collective impact. As I mentioned, we didn't at that point know the focus of our issue, but came together with curiosity and the intention of solving a complex food-related problem together. And then following that workshop, we applied for and received coaching support. So between June and March of this year, we've worked with our coach to define a sustainable food system and identify food security as the issue we wanted to focus on. Get a better sense of the issue through our collective perspectives and exploration of the data. We chose 2 focus neighborhoods based on the greatest need around food security and vulnerability data, as well as existing community assets that we felt we could build on in those 2 neighborhoods. We did a scan of inspiring projects from other local and international municipalities to help us imagine and articulate different ways of approaching the program. And that was really helpful. I mean, the way it's kind of been presented, you're meant to look forward to what your population level outcome is and kind of the intervention points or I guess the levers that can see that shift. And we were having trouble really envisioning what that could look like on the ground. So we, shifted the order a little bit and really started to think about, well, what kinds of specific projects or policy changes would kind of spur this type of change, and then have since been able to go back and begin thinking more about those metric pieces. We developed some foundation principles for working together and operating within the community, and through all this work developed our theory of change, which I'll get to in a moment. But that theory of change piece really came together at our second BC Healthy Communities and Interweave workshop, which was in March, and is the second big blue circle on the slide. For us, I would say the biggest value in having a coach was to challenge our assumptions, sometimes playing that important role of devil's advocate and helping us to continually dig deeper on the root causes of the issues and the opportunities to work further upstream, as well as kind of guide us on the collective impact path, as many of us weren't familiar with it as an approach or a process. It was helpful to have someone who could hold that bigger picture in working towards that. It's also been really great to have our coach to help us set some of our meeting agendas and come up with some creative activities for generating discussion and decision making and help facilitate at key sticky points in the process. So in April of this year, we applied for and were awarded a Plan H Growing Impact Grant, which BC Healthy Communities is also a partner in delivering. And so it's been helpful, really spending the time to set those foundational, working relationships and process, and then is looking like for us, it's going to provide access to a number of other supports to continue on this path, which is great because I think, traditionally a lot of funding streams are more based on specific projects, and to have the support to actually think through the outcomes that you want to achieve has been really helpful on a community-wide scale. So up until March of this year, I would say that a lot of our work was very inward-facing. As I mentioned, building relationships, defining the issue, exploring the data, building that theory of change. And as we're moving forward, we're really looking to have an increasingly external presence and focus. So here is our kind of schematic of how we envision affecting change, our theory of change. You'll see the foundational principles beginning from the bottom there are really critical for how we approach the issue and work together as stakeholders with the community. So this includes seeing food security as part of a larger sustainable and resilient food system, and aligning our actions to support that as well. Seeing another principle is investing in social capital and connection, recognizing that individuals and families that are vulnerable and food insecure also tend to be socially isolated for various reasons. We've articulated 4 impact areas or access points for food security, and the importance of each depends on the context of the neighborhoods. But at the most basic level, availability is where there is fresh, healthy food available in the community. Access describes whether people can physically get to that food. Food deserts, some of you may be familiar with that term, but the ability of people to walk to a grocery store is a big issue in Surrey. If they can physically get to the food, of course the question becomes whether they can afford it, and this is one of the most complex and challenging pieces to get at from a systemic point of view. And finally, even if people can access and afford food, are they choosing healthy options, and do they know how to prepare it? So we've explored key outcomes that will influence each of those 4 areas, and is highlighted in those bulleted lists underneath. And we aim to see the focus of our work, obviously, at the community and systemic levels. But we also recognize that initiatives that improve the day-to-day lives of individuals and families in the short term can help to build that trust and momentum for the larger scale change over the coming years. So we do see a place for kind of the individual, the community, and the systemic shifts to occur. And then I meant to update the slide, but you can see the placeholders for targets along the top. And of course, a key aspect of collective impact is creating those metrics that can be measured over time. So we, in addition to having the high level, population level outcome that we want to see around measured changes in food security. And there is some data on that in the city, but there are also gaps in that it doesn't cover people under 18 years old, and there's not a commitment to continue the survey indefinitely. So we're looking to establish long-term research partnerships to ensure that we are able to continue that measurement, and also identify kind of these sub-indicators that are aligned with each of those impact areas. So for instance, the number or percentage of population that are living within a 10-minute walk of a grocery store would help us assess access, and an income measure might be around the percent of population that can afford healthy food based on the dietitian's report on the cost of food. So just a final slide. As I mentioned, a lot of work has been very inward-facing, developing those strong working relationships and understanding the issues. And now we have a number of, our next steps are much more outward-facing, so really going out into the community and doing lots of community and stakeholder engagement to build those relationships, and also pressure test our assumptions, ensure that the types of projects that are emerging really make sense and that we can design them appropriately for the neighborhood. Needing to better define the role of the group and the governance structure. As I mentioned, solidifying those metrics and particularly that long-term research partnership, and then building on the momentum that we've seen recently around a couple of emerging tangible projects, and taking advantage of those opportunities as an opportunity to prototype and test our theory of change and learn as we go. So that's it. I think I may have taken a few extra minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It was worth it. It's so exciting to see how this initiative is developing and continuing to adapt and evolve. And I think it's just such a great example of you know, as both Michelle and Jillian were sharing, how, you know, we start by setting these goals and developing a theory of change, but there is this process of adapting as you go, as you learn more and engage more with the community. So that's great. I want to open up the floor for some time for questions for either Jillian or Michelle or Maggie, anything that might be popping for you. I know many of you are gathered together at group sites, so again, if you have a group scribe that wants to type into the chat box, please feel free to do that. There's been some great discussion going on in the chat box already about some of the examples that both Jillian and Michelle shared. So you can follow along there if you're interested in some of the questions that have been planted there around engagement and around working with rural communities. But we'll take a minute to welcome any other questions. And if any of you are on the phone line, if you want to just use the little hands up icon at the top, you can flag to me if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally. That would be welcome as well. So in the meantime, actually, maybe while we're inviting those questions and people need a few minutes to type them in, I know there were some questions about engagement processes. So Michelle, anything you'd like to share related to engagement and example from Seattle Roadmap as we're waiting for other questions to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now. Thanks.
I did respond in the chat box to that question, and I have to say I am not up totally on their engagement strategy, but I did note when I was reviewing their 2015 progress report that, just trying to find the slide, they do specifically say in that report that the strategy of parent and community engagement has not had as much traction. It's been more challenging than all of the others, and it will be a focus of attention over the next years to try and figure that one out.
Great, thanks.
Whatever they've tried, it hasn't been working.
We can be sure to send that link as well. And Jillian, any thoughts from you about engagement processes and how you've seen that play out with various collective impact initiatives you've been supporting?
Sure. So Some good examples, I mean, part of the Youth Collective Impact Initiative out of Ontario that we're running, actually part of our requirement is that youth are really engaged in the decision-making process, and often it ends up being not just youth are engaged, but people with lived experience, so perhaps parents of youth who would be targeted. One example that comes to my mind is our group that's the most furthest along, actually, our Hamilton Healthy Birth Weights Coalition. One of their big focus areas is on young parents, and so the young parents, often women, come to there and access the integrated system of care, and as some of them are sort of emerging as leaders, they end up bridging them in as peer leaders and researchers, and then ultimately part of sort of the core members of their team. We know our Kingston group has a youth council that they use as sort of they bring issues to the council, and then the council makes decisions and then brings them back to the core members. We've seen engagement, a lot of focus groups is a big way of engaging. So just a few examples around how engaging people with lived experience or through different tools and approaches can actually really help enhance your initiative and your theory of change.
Great, thank you. Just a technical note, someone was mentioning they're getting some feedback in the speaker, so you can always just mute, you can mute your computer speakers if you're using the teleconference line. So lots of people saying they'd love to get more information on these resources, some of the examples that have been shared, so again, we'll be sure to share those out. We have a specific question for Maggie about the Surrey project that you mentioned governance model, and is that how you're ensuring sustainability? So Maggie, maybe we'll turn it over to you just to share a little bit about the governance work that you're doing right now. If you're there.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm here. So we're just in the process of establishing that, so it's not fully developed at this point, but we're using the model of a kind of constellation governance where we have our leadership team and then a working group that acts somewhat autonomously to facilitate and lead and align in each of those 4 impact areas, the availability, access, income, and literacy, and using the leadership team as a way to kind of coordinate and bridge communication among those. So it's still, and we're also, in terms of thinking about sustainability, the idea is that then groups can be involved in the areas where that are most relevant for them, and the time commitment wouldn't be so big as if they were participating through the leadership team, which is a much bigger time commitment. What else was I going to add to that? Oh, just in terms of we're being conscious of only adding on the working groups as kind of capacity allows. So we, for instance, right now have a very active access group and are looking to support the development of an income working group so that we can, move some of these pieces forward. But it is a work in progress. And we're developing a terms of reference to kind of define that more clearly for everyone involved.
Thanks, Maggie. Again, I think this just speaks to some of this initial development work and the various components that often make up part of the work of coming together across multiple partners. And certainly the focus on governance and structuring is something that we often support through the coaching process, sort of often a little bit later on in the development process. So again, lots of requests for some more examples, so we'll be sure to share some resources coming out of the webinar. I'd like to take a few minutes just in the interest of time to ensure we have time to speak to this, just to share a little bit about some upcoming opportunities with BC Healthy Communities and Innoweave if people are interested in participating in collective impact workshops and possibly coaching as well. So this slide shows the collective impact process that we work together to support. So typically the way we structure this is that the collective impact supports include 2 full-day workshops, and they're generally spread about 4 to 8 months apart, depending on how groups are advancing and what timing makes sense. So 2 full-day workshops, and in between and after each of those, groups have the opportunity to access coaching support that supports some of these key elements you see in those bottom arrows. So starting out with focusing on really clarifying population-level outcome goals, developing a theory of change, continuing to refine the theory of change and pressure test it, developing some clarity around shared measures, and again, continuing to test and move towards the launch of your collective impact initiative. So what we are offering starting in the fall, this fall, October, November, is that we're going to be offering Collective Impact Workshop 1. We know there's a lot of interest from many communities around the province, and so we're choosing to deliver this this time online so that we can accommodate multiple communities across the province. And so this Workshop 1 will be divided into 2 parts, so 2 3-hour sessions that will be scheduled approximately 3 to 4 weeks apart. And in between, there'll be a chance for your group to do some work and get some feedback from a coach in terms of moving forward. And again, following Workshop 1, the collaborators would have the opportunity to request additional coaching support to move forward in a similar way to the work that the Food Security Group in Surrey has been doing, as Maggie shared with us. So following this webinar, we will send out a link. If you are interested in participating in a workshop, you can just send us a note using that link to let us know that you're interested and would like to request an application. And our teams at BC Healthy Communities and INWEAVE will follow up with a conversation with you just to share a little bit more detail about the workshop and ensure that it seems like a good fit. And then we'll be accepting applications for the workshop on September 15th is our deadline for that. So that Workshop 1, the focus, again, is just really honing in on population-level outcome goals, starting to map out and learn more about the theory of change approach, developing a bit of a community engagement strategy to test your theory of change, and developing a bit of an action plan moving forward over the subsequent 4 to 6 month period. So again, that's Workshop 1, which we'd offer in 2 sessions online in October and November. There's a question in the chat box that I can see about how many applications will be awarded, and in the true spirit of adaptive action and learning, we're not sure at this point. Because we're doing the session online, we are able to accommodate more communities that way than delivering in person, but some of it will be in response to the requests that we receive. So if you are interested, it would be helpful to let us know sooner than later, just so we can have that information for our own planning purposes. That would be very helpful. So just recapping some of the pieces that Michelle shared earlier about the preconditions to keep in mind about whether it makes sense to proceed with really digging deeper into collective impact and participating in the workshop. These are some of the things we'll be talking to you about, but ensuring that you have a really clear and urgent issue in your community that requires population-level change, and that there's commitment and interest in working towards that population-level change together. That you have some of these resources and champions to support the development process, and that there's a committed group of core partners to move that work forward initially. So we have about a couple minutes. If there are any more questions about that, welcome any questions in the chat box. And before we close, we also want to let you know that in addition to collective impact, as Jillian mentioned, INWEAVE also offers a number of other supports. They do have a call out right now for some of their other modules that they're offering with a deadline of July 4th. So I'll let Jillian speak a little bit to that before we close.
Thanks, Stacey. So I mentioned before our range of supports. We have coaching, we have workshops. I definitely encourage you to go to inweave.ca, explore the different approaches, take the self-assessment, see what's the right, whether or not a certain approach could be right for you. I definitely encourage you to sign up for the INWEAVE's newsletter. You can see the upcoming dates for workshops and that sort of thing. We are going to have a series of workshops coming up for some of these modules in the fall that you could apply to attend. That July 4th date that Stacey was referring to is our date for the coaching grant applications. So if you had already participated in a workshop, typically those are the organizations that would apply to receive coaching from us. In general, if you're interested, I have put my email in the chat box. We'll send it out as well after. But really, I think the fall workshops could be a great place to start, and even before that, signing up for the newsletter to know when those dates are.
Great, thank you, Jillian. And similarly at BC Healthy Communities, we also offer a number of other supports in BC through different trainings and workshops, as well as our granting programs. So similarly, you can sign up for our newsletter, and our Plan H program has a separate newsletter as well, which we do provide a lot of announcements through that program about upcoming opportunities. So 1:30, here we are. It does fly by. Just want to say a big thank you to Maggie, to Michelle, and to Jillian for all of the wealth of experience and learnings that you shared with us today. We will be in touch via email with all of you with some follow-up resources, and look forward to hearing from those of you who are interested in participating in workshops. We'll send that link out to you to request an application for those of you who are interested. Thanks again. We look forward to connecting.
Thanks, everyone.